What no one tells you about enlightenment until you're ready to hear it. There is a quiet truth that follows every human being, like a shadow trailing just behind the heel. It waits in the pauses between breaths, in the subtle ache that surfaces when the world grows still. It rarely speaks loudly because it does not need to. It knows that sooner or later, every person turns toward it, whether out of exhaustion, wonder, heartbreak, or clarity. That truth is simple. Beneath all the noise of life, beneath the rush of desire, beneath the endless pursuit of more, there is a longing for peace that does not depend on anything at all. So much of life is spent wandering. We chase the next thing we believe will make us whole, certain that fulfillment is only one achievement, one relationship, one transformation away. Yet even in those brief moments, when the world gives us exactly what we asked for, the satisfaction dissolves like salt in water. Joy rises, flares and fades. Sorrow rises, flares and fades. Everything moves, and we move with it, sometimes gracefully, often unwillingly. And somewhere inside us, a quiet question asks, is there something here that does not tremble, something that doesn't vanish when the conditions change? Many never stop long enough to hear that question clearly. But for some, the question becomes louder than all the distractions. When the search for comfort becomes the source of our discomfort, the heart begins to shift. Something inside turns gently, almost imperceptibly, toward a different kind of freedom. Enlightenment is often imagined as a burst of light, a triumphant moment when the universe reveals its secrets like a curtain drawn back from a grand stage. People picture bliss, perfection, the erasure of all wounds and weaknesses. But the truth is quieter, more intimate, and far more ordinary than most would ever expect. Enlightenment is not an achievement, not a badge to earn, or a destiny reserved for the chosen. It is the recognition of what has always been here, patiently waiting, like a pool of still water underneath a turbulent stream. Before anyone is ready to hear what enlightenment truly is, they must first notice the weight they carry. Not the weight of responsibilities or losses, but the subtler burden of being someone. The burden of defending a self we're not even sure we understand. The burden of constantly constructing, repairing and protecting an identity made of fragile stories. The burden of believing every passing thought is somehow mine. Every emotion me, every experience who I am. So much suffering comes from this quiet clinging, not because the self is bad, but because it is mistreated, held too tightly, feared too deeply, worshipped too blindly. And yet, when one stands still long enough to feel the truth of impermanence flowing through every breath, something loosens. The edges of the self begin to soften. For a moment, the need to be someone impressive, successful, unbroken fades. And in that moment, a different kind of knowing appears. Not a belief, not a philosophy, a knowing that feels like returning home after being lost for years. It begins simply, with the noticing of a breath, with the recognition that awareness is here, even when the mind is restless, with the understanding that each thought that appears also disappears, like clouds drifting across an open sky. The sky does not cling to the clouds. Awareness does not cling to experience, except when habit forces it to. To walk the path toward enlightenment is not to become more spiritual or more pure. It is to become more honest. Honest about the stories we tell ourselves. Honest about the fears we hide, even from our own eyes. Honest about the cravings that pull us like unseen strings. Honest about the truth that nothing we try to hold stays the same. Not the body, not the emotions, not the relationships, not the world. And yet awareness remains. Quiet, steady, unshaken. No one tells you that enlightenment isn't something you add to yourself. It's what remains when you stop adding. It is the silence underneath every thought. It is the clarity that arises when the heart is no longer bargaining with life. It is the freedom that reveals itself when the mind stops trying to rearrange reality into a shape it finds acceptable. But this understanding rarely appears through force. It unfolds gently, the way dawn seeps across the horizon without ever announcing itself. You notice it only because everything becomes visible. The path does not begin with perfection. It begins with pain, not as punishment, but as a teacher. Pain has a way of stripping away illusions, of showing us what cannot be relied on. When the things we cling to slip through our grasp, we are left with a trembling question. If this is not secure, what is? If this does not last, what does? Every person has felt that trembling. Some chase new attachments to silence it. Others grow numb. But a few, sometimes out of desperation, sometimes out of grace, turn inward, not as escape, but as exploration. They begin to notice the rawness of their own longing, the tenderness beneath their defenses. They discover that the soul's deepest ache is not for pleasure or power or recognition, but for truth. Truth not as an idea, but as an experience. Truth that does not depend on opinion. Truth that cannot be argued, only realized. This turning inward is not a retreat from the world. It is the beginning of intimacy with life itself. Awareness becomes clearer. Sensations become more vivid. Layers of distraction fall away, revealing the tremble of the moment just as it is, without embellishment, without judgment, without needing to be anything more than what it already is. No one tells you that enlightenment feels less like rising above the human experience and more like sinking fully into it. Not drowning in emotions, but recognizing that emotions are waves, not prisons. Not escaping the body, but feeling it with clarity and compassion. Not detaching from life, but meeting it with a tenderness so vast it can hold both joy and grief without turning away. You begin to see that every moment, even the painful ones, contains a doorway, a quiet opening into awareness, a chance to notice that behind every thought is space, behind every emotion is impermanence, behind every experience is the simple fact of knowing. And this knowing does not struggle. It does not resist. It does not cling. It is as close as your next breath, and yet most people live their lives without recognizing it. What no one tells you about enlightenment is that the path is not found in sacred texts alone, not reserved for retreats or meditation halls. The path is woven through the smallest movements of living, in the way you wash your hands, in the way you listen without preparing your reply, in the moment you pause before reacting, feeling the spark of anger or fear before it becomes a flame, in the taste of tea, the sound of footsteps, the quiet between raindrops. Awakening is not somewhere else. It is here, hidden in plain sight. As awareness deepens, the mind begins to lose its hunger for constant stimulation. The heart softens, not out of weakness, but out of understanding. Compassion arises naturally, not as a moral duty, but because you see yourself in every person who suffers, every person who longs, every person who fears. You begin to recognize that everyone is carrying their own invisible burden, their own unanswered questions, their own trembling shadow trailing behind the heel. And in seeing that, judgment fades. What replaces it is not indifference, but a quiet warmth, a willingness to meet the world gently, even when it's harsh, a willingness to extend kindness, even when no one is watching, a willingness to live with eyes open, heart open, mind open, not because it is easy, but because it is true. Enlightenment is not a destination. It is the gradual unmasking of the present moment, the subtle recognition that the peace you've been searching for does not arrive from the outside. It emerges when resistance dissolves, when you stop demanding that life match your expectations, when you stop fighting the nature of change, when you stop insisting that the self must be protected at all costs. In this letting go, a profound ease appears. Not passive resignation, but freedom. You begin to see that everything, every breath, every sensation, there comes every rise and fall of emotion notice is part of a dance. How much of life is spent resisting what the mind can comprehend. And instead of trying to control the rhythm against uncertainty, you learn to move grasping for solid ground in a world built entirely of movement. It negotiates with reality constantly, trying to bend the river of experience into a straight line that leads somewhere familiar. But the river moves as it moves, and the more tightly you try to hold it, the more its current strains against your grip. No one tells you that enlightenment begins with the courage to unclench the fist. Not to abandon responsibility, not to avoid action, but to release the illusion that your safety lies in control. When the mind softens its grip even for a moment, a different kind of clarity emerges. You begin to see that the world is not attacking you when it changes. It is simply unfolding. This recognition is not dramatic. It is not accompanied by angelic choirs or celestial visions. It feels more like exhaling after holding your breath for years. A subtle release in the chest, a loosening in the jaw, a space opening in the mind where tension used to live, and in that space, awareness stands quietly, patient and vast. The more you rest in this space, the more you begin to realize how much of your suffering came from weaving stories around what you experience. A sensation arises in the body, and the mind turns it into a problem. A thought passes through, and the mind builds a fortress around it. An emotion flares, and suddenly it becomes a verdict on your worth, your path, your future. But when you watch closely, you see that none of these stories are required for life to unfold. Experience happens regardless of the narrative. Awareness remains untouched by it all. Enlightenment is not the elimination of thought. It is the understanding that thoughts are simply visitors in a house they do not own. There will be days when the mind is restless. Days when old fears resurface with surprising strength. Days when everything feels heavy and dense. But even then, awareness is here, like a clear sky wide enough to hold any storm. The goal is not to get rid of the storm. Storms belong to nature. The goal is to recognize that you are the sky, not the weather. This recognition does not always come easily. The mind has spent decades convincing you that you are the chaos it produces. It whispers that your worth depends on your accomplishments. It warns you that mistakes define your identity. It insists that you must keep running, or else everything will fall apart. And for a long time you may believe it, not because the mind is malicious, but because it is afraid. It clings to patterns that once protected you, even if they no longer serve. When you begin to see these patterns clearly, compassion naturally arises, not only for others, but for yourself. You recognize how hard the mind has been working to keep you safe. You see how much energy has gone into shielding you from pain, from shame, from uncertainty, and instead of fighting the mind, you begin to soothe it. You begin to listen to it not as an authority, but as a frightened child who needs understanding rather than obedience. This compassion becomes the ground on which enlightenment grows. Not a spiritual achievement, not a metaphysical breakthrough, but a softening. A willingness to stop harming yourself with expectations that no human could fulfill. A willingness to forgive the parts of you that stumble, that forget, that cling, that fear. A willingness to treat yourself with the gentleness you've always reserved for others. In this gentleness, the journey takes on a new texture. You begin to move through the world with more patience. You start to notice the small moments of quiet that were always available, but often overlooked. the stillness between heartbeats, the slight pause at the top of an inhale, the subtle hum of life in your chest. These are not grand revelations. They are reminders, invitations, open doors into presence. Presence is not a mystical state. It is simply the absence of distraction. When you inhabit a moment fully, when you feel the warmth of sunlight without thinking about yesterday, when you listen to someone speak without planning your reply, when you walk without rushing toward the next destination, something inside aligns. Awareness sharpens. The world becomes more vivid. Even mundane moments shimmer with a kind of sacredness. But this sacredness is not something you add to the world. It is something you remove from your perception, the fog of inattention. When the fog lifts, even slightly, life reveals itself with a simplicity that can feel astonishing. The colors seem deeper. Sounds become clearer. Time feels spacious. And in this spaciousness, the heart knows itself again. No one tells you that enlightenment is not a peak to ascend, but a weight to set down. The weight of pretending, the weight of striving, the weight of believing you must earn your right to exist. When these burdens fall away, even momentarily, you taste a freedom, so natural it feels familiar, as if you've known it all along. This freedom does not require you to reject the world. You do not need to escape society, abandon your relationships, or withdraw to a cave. Enlightenment is fully compatible with daily life. In fact, daily life is its perfect training ground. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to witness the mind. Every frustration becomes a chance to practice patience. Every desire becomes a moment to observe craving without being consumed by it. Some imagine awakening as a removal from humanity. In truth, it makes you more deeply human. You feel more, you notice more, you appreciate more, you suffer less, but not because life becomes easy, rather because you stop adding unnecessary suffering on top of what already exists. Pain still arises, but you no longer turn it into a story. Fear still appears, but you no longer bow to it. Desire still comes and goes, but you no longer mistake it for guidance. You begin to trust awareness more than the fleeting movements within it. And with this trust comes a profound simplicity. You realize that you do not need to seek meaning outside of the present moment. You do not need to craft a perfect future in order to feel at peace. Peace is already here, available in every breath, concealed only by the mind's restless wandering. As awareness deepens, something else begins to unfold, something subtle but transformative. You start to see the interconnectedness of everything, not as a concept but as an experience. You feel how each action affects the world, how each word ripples into the hearts of others. You sense that every being you meet is navigating their own maze of hopes and fears, joys and losses. And you understand that compassion is not an obligation. It is the only response that makes sense when you see reality clearly. This understanding changes the way you move through the world. You become more deliberate. You speak with more care. You listen with more presence. You act with more awareness of consequences. Not because you are trying to be virtuous, but because the illusion of separateness has begun to dissolve. In this dissolution, loneliness softens. Isolation fades. You feel a quiet belonging, not to a group, not to a belief system, but to existence itself. You recognize that you are part of a vast, intricate unfolding, and that everything within it is temporary, precious, interconnected. This recognition does not make you passive. It makes you awake, awake to the fleeting beauty of each moment, awake to the suffering of others, awake to the responsibility that comes with awareness. Enlightenment is not the end of involvement. It is the beginning of conscious participation. Yet even as the heart opens, Even as compassion deepens, the ego will still whisper. It will still try to reclaim its territory. It will try to turn awakening into an identity. It will want to be the enlightened one, admired, respected, secure. But awakening slips through the fingers of anyone who tries to possess it. The moment you cling to it, you lose. This is why humility is the natural fragrance of enlightenment. Not a forced modesty, but a recognition that there is no I who awakens. There is only awakening appearing, like sunlight breaking through clouds. No one claims the light, one simply stands in it. When this humility ripens, life becomes simpler still. You stop needing to prove anything. You stop needing to win every argument. You stop needing to be right. You stop needing to be seen. Instead, you begin to rest in the quiet truth, beneath all identities, the truth that awareness is enough. Awareness is the root. Awareness is the refuge. Awareness is the freedom that cannot be taken from you. And slowly, through patience, through honesty, through gentle presence, you begin to recognize that enlightenment was never hiding. It was simply waiting for the noise to settle. As the path unfolds, there is a moment quiet, almost secret, when the heart begins to sense a truth it cannot yet name. A soft recognition dawns that every experience, every breath, every thought arrives on its own and leaves on its own. You witness this again and again. Sounds appear without warning, ripple through awareness, and dissolve. Sensations bloom in the body, some pleasant, some sharp, and then fade back into silence. Emotions rise with their familiar heat or heaviness, linger just long enough to make their presence known, and then change, soften, or vanish. Nothing remains fixed. Nothing belongs to you in the way you once assumed. The more deeply you see this, the more the world transforms without anything actually changing. The same people surround you. The same routines unfold. The same challenges remain. But your relationship to them shifts. And in that shift, a spaciousness opens. You begin to sense that it is possible to meet life without tightening around it, without the habitual resistance that once seemed inevitable, without the impulse to brace against the future or rewrite the past. In this spaciousness, even pain becomes more bearable. You no longer turn it into a personal failure or an omen of something worse. You feel it directly, raw, immediate, unembellished. The body contracts or burns or aches, but the mind does not add layers of fear, judgment, or narrative. And in this simplicity, suffering diminishes. Pain remains pain, but it is no longer amplified by the story of my pain, my problem, my punishment. It is simply a sensation, moving through a field of awareness. This alone feels like a liberation. But as the practice deepens, another realization begins to emerge, that the self you have been protecting all this time is not what you believed it to be. You watch thoughts appear out of nowhere, without your choosing. You watch emotions surge without your permission. You watch the body breathe, digest, heal, grow, age, all without your control. You observe decisions forming in the mind like waves rising in the ocean, each shaped by memories, biology, conditioning, and countless causes you never consciously touched. And slowly, gently, you begin to question the solidity of this. No one tells you that enlightenment involves this unraveling, that it requires a willingness to look closely at the self, not to destroy it, but to understand its true nature. At first, this can feel unsettling, as if the ground beneath you is shifting. But in time, the fear softens. What remains is a profound relief, because you see that the self is not a burden you must carry. It is simply a process, fluid, changing, responsive, like a flame shaped by the air around it. When this insight ripens, everything becomes lighter. Criticism doesn't cut as deeply because there is no rigid identity for it to wound. Praise doesn't inflate you because there is no permanent self to decorate. You become less reactive, not because you suppress your feelings, but because there is no longer a strong me needing to be defended at every turn. You can listen more openly, speak more truthfully, act more fearlessly, because your actions are not constantly orbiting around self-preservation. This freedom does not make you indifferent. Quite the opposite. When the self is no longer the center of your universe, compassion flows more naturally. You sense the fragility of others, the complexity of their joys and sorrow. You recognize how many invisible battles they are fighting, how many wounds they carry, how many fears they hide. And instead of judgment, your response is tenderness. Not pity, not sentimental kindness. A deep, clear, grounded compassion, born from seeing that their suffering is not separate from your own. You begin to offer this compassion in small ways, in the way you speak, in the way you pause before reacting, in the way you look at someone with the full presence of being. These gestures may go unnoticed, but they ripple outward, softening the world in subtle but powerful ways. Because awakening is not measured by mystical visions or supernatural insights. It is measured by how gently you live, how honestly you meet each moment, how deeply you can love without clinging, without fear, without needing anything in return. This gentleness is not weakness. It is the courage to remain open in a world that often encourages closing, to feel deeply, even when it hurts, to rest in awareness, even when the mind storms, to trust in impermanence, even when everything in you wants stability. You begin to understand that permanence was never the point. The point was to learn how to meet change with grace. As this understanding settles, your perception of time shifts. The future no longer consumes your attention the way it once did. You plan, you prepare, you act, but without the anxious hunger for certainty. And the past loosens its grip. Memories still arise, but they no longer dictate your identity. Regrets soften. Old wounds lose their sharpness. You realize that the past lives only in the present moment, and that healing arises not from rewriting history, but from opening fully to the now. In this openness, gratitude blooms, quiet, unforced, pervasive. You feel grateful, not as a practice, but as a natural response to presence. Grateful for your breath, grateful for your senses, grateful for the people who walk beside you, even if only briefly. Grateful for the way life continues, moment after moment, offering chance after chance to awaken. And through this gratitude, the world becomes less hostile, less threatening. You no longer see life as something happening to you. You see it as something happening with you, a co-creation of countless forces, each interwoven with your own awareness. This shift brings peace, not because the world has changed, but because you have stopped demanding that it obey your expectation. There will still be challenges. Enlightenment does not erase difficulty. Bodies still age. Relationships still evolve. Loss still arrives. But you meet these experiences with a steadier heart. You see that suffering is not a punishment. It is a natural part of existence. And instead of collapsing into self-pity or bitterness, you allow the experience to unfold. Like someone watching rain fall on a window, you witness the sorrow without drowning in it. With time, this witnessing deepens until even the darkest emotions cannot overshadow the underlying clarity of awareness. You learn to rest in the quiet space beneath every storm, the vastness that holds everything without being touched by any of it. This is the heart of awakening, not escape, not transcendence, but intimacy with reality. And this intimacy creates a stillness that moves with you everywhere. Not a rigid calm, but a flexible, living presence. Even in the midst of chaos, the stillness remains, like a mountain hidden beneath shifting clouds. Some call this stillness enlightenment. Others call it freedom. But names do not matter. What matters is the experience, an unshakable trust in awareness, a recognition that you are not separate from the flow of life, and a deep, abiding peace that does not depend on circumstance. You begin to move through the world lightly, like someone walking at dawn, watching the sky brighten, knowing that everything is exactly as it needs to be, not because it is perfect, but because it is real, because it is here, because it is enough. There comes a time on the path when the search itself begins to feel different. Not because you have found everything, but because you have stopped running from anything. The heart becomes less like a clenched fist and more like an open palm, able to hold the world without possessing it. And in this openness, another layer of understanding quietly blooms. Awakening is not something you reach. It is something you allow. For so long, the mind tries to force clarity, to engineer peace, to grasp insight the way one might grab a rope in darkness. But enlightenment is not the result of effort. It is what remains when the effort relaxes. It is the revealing of a truth that has always been here, obscured only by the mind's struggle to become something else. In these final steps, though they are not really steps, just deepening moments of presence, you begin to sense a profound truth. Nothing you experience can complete you. Nothing you achieve can anchor you. Nothing you gain can give you what you truly seek. And strangely, instead of despair, this brings relief. Because the peace you long for is not found in the attaining, but in the release. You feel this most clearly in the quiet moments. When the world around you pauses, when the mind grows still enough that you can sense the subtle hum of awareness underneath everything. In that hum, there is no fear, no striving, no story, only a simple, undeniable presence. You cannot describe it fully, and yet you know it more intimately than your own name. This presence is the ground of being, the place where all seeking ends. But even as this recognition deepens, life continues. Days unfold, thoughts come and go. Old patterns sometimes reappear, like ghosts revisiting familiar rooms. But now they no longer frighten you. You no longer mistake them for yourself. You see them as echoes, habits, remnants of conditioning. They arise, play out their energy, and fade. And through it all, awareness remains steady, like a candle flame that does not waver even when the door opens. With this steadiness comes a deep inner confidence, not arrogance, not certainty, but a trust that whatever arises, you can meet it, not because you have become invincible, but because you have stopped demanding that life spare you from discomfort. You know that whatever comes, it will change, and whatever changes, you can witness without losing yourself. In this witnessing, compassion matures into something expansive and unforced. It flows toward those who suffer not because you are trying to be good, but because you recognize your own former confusion in their eyes. You see the way they tighten around their pain. You see how they mistake their thoughts for reality. You see how they cling to identities that wound them, and instead of judgment, you feel tenderness. You begin to meet people as they are, without projecting your expectations onto them. You listen more, not because it is polite, but because you are genuinely curious. You speak less, not out of withdrawal, but because silence often contains more truth than words. Your presence becomes a refuge, not through intention, but simply because it is grounded. Those who encounter you may not know why they feel calmer around you. They may not understand the source of your steadiness, but something in them relaxes, because the human heart recognizes peace even when it is unspoken. This ripple of peace is one of the quiet gifts of awakening. It spreads without effort, without agenda. It touches lives in subtle ways, a conversation, a gesture, a moment of presence. And these moments take root in others, opening doors they may not even know were closed. And still, awakening is not the end point. It is not the finish line of spiritual practice. It is the beginning of living fully. When the illusion of separation begins to dissolve, a deeper participation in life becomes possible. You engage with the world, not from fear or lack, but from clarity and love. You act not to preserve an identity, but to respond to the moment. This responsiveness is the essence of wisdom, fluid, adaptable, attuned. You no longer rely on rigid beliefs or fixed opinions. You meet each situation with fresh eyes, unburdened by the weight of past conclusions. Even your sense of self becomes more transparent, more flexible. You are no longer bound by the need to be consistent, because you have seen that identity is not a cage you must inhabit. It is simply a set of patterns that arise when needed and dissolve when they are not. In this freedom, life becomes profoundly simple. Not simplistic, not detached, but simple in the way a clear stream is simple. Nothing extra, nothing forced. You do what needs to be done. You let go when it is time to let go. You rest when rest calls. Act when action calls. Speak when truth calls. And through it all, there is a gentle gratitude for the mystery of existence, for the way life moves through you, for the way awareness illuminates every corner of experience, for the way the heart keeps opening, even after everything it has endured. As you walk this path, you realize that enlightenment was never about escaping the world. It was about seeing it clearly, holding it lightly, loving it fully. And in the quiet of that understanding, a deeper truth begins to shine. You were never separate from the world. You were never broken. You were never unworthy of peace. You were simply learning to remember what had always been true. The path to awakening is not a journey towards something new. It is a return, a remembering of your original nature, the spacious, loving awareness that was present before the stories, before the fears, before the identities, before the world convinced you to forget. And in this remembering, the heart rests, not in resignation, not in indifference, but in a peace so intimate it needs no explanation. A peace that neither clings nor resists. A peace that shines through joy and sorrow alike. A peace that makes room for the whole world. This is what no one tells you about enlightenment until you are ready to hear it. It does not make you more than human. It frees you to be fully human, to feel without drowning, to love without fear, to live without clinging, to open without guarding, to breathe without searching. It frees you to be here, utterly, completely, tenderly here, with whatever this moment holds. And in that presence, the light you once sought outside yourself reveals its true source. It was never elsewhere. It was never hidden. It was never lost. It was simply waiting for you to be still enough to notice.